Hello everyone, welcome to another Otaku Bible study in Shady Oak Ministries. I'm of course Shady Oak, and today we are going over the anime I'm sure you're all familiar with, Clannad. And Clannad also including the second season known as the After story. I want to encourage those of you who haven't seen this anime to stop the study right now. I'm sure it's the last thing you'd expect to hear from a pastor, but I want you guys to understand the significance of these passages, illustrations, and verses that we're going to go to without me having to feel guilty of being, guilty itself of the biggest spoilers that you guys have ever heard in your lives. So, with that being said, I'd like you to turn to the book of Galatians chapter 6 and verse 2, and in this we're going to be analyzing the essential law and basically the assumed ground of what it means to be in a Christian walk and the commandments that we were given to follow. Paul the Apostle said this, "Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ." Now, with this law being set on terms with something you would consider more Old Testament-y like a commandment, we need to really ask ourselves, what is this law of Christ that is being commanded and demanded of us? What is so essential that it not only requires us to bear with people, this law of living with people, so to speak, as to share one another's burdens, but under whose authority are we being given these orders? Well, no other authority than Jesus himself. At the Last Supper, he said this in the Gospel of John, chapter 13 and verse 34, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another." And then goes on in the passage to say, "This is how the world will know that you are my disciples, that you have love for one another." And this word love is very unique in the sense that it was used in the Greek language as the term agape, which was more expansive, unique, and implied more out of our term love. Again, for those of you who've been with previous studies with us, especially in My Little Pony Season 2, we've gone a lot into the four definitions of the Greek term love, which was categorized with eros, storge, phileo, and agape. Eros referring to physical attraction, just as much to food as another person. Storge, affection, just doing something nice for somebody, an act of love or charity, as some would call it. Phileo, a mutual respect and friendship, and then of course agape, which is being illustrated here. And it was in the Greek language beforehand, but just like most English terms, they take on new meaning when demonstrated by a very significant individual. And just like the term passion means to dedicate your life, body, and soul to someone or a cause, that passion was then retranslated and used to describe the sufferings of Jesus on the cross, where he literally dedicated his body to our salvation and establishing a relationship with us. The same thing is also true in that when Paul the Apostle set it out in layman's terms in 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 8, which we'll talk about later in the study, Jesus was essentially saying that this kind of love, agape love, which was essentially a godly form of love, a complete and total and, basically self-sacrificial form of love, is what Jesus is talking about here. The love that he exemplified in his life, he then calls us to do ourselves, because we will stand out in the world as being totally unique and totally demonstrative of his own character if we emphasize that one aspect of his character that made him more unique than any other individual, that he loved people in the way that only God can. And that's what Paul was getting at when he said to bear one another's burdens. We are fulfilling the law of Christ. And that law of loving people implies that with people comes people problems. And noting Jesus himself admitting, saying, "This can be done, but you need my help because you've already seen me pull it off." And just like Jesus set himself as the example of what God's love looked like, we get examples throughout our entire lives and even through the modem of entertainment, and why I loved the anime Clannad myself and the emotional roller coaster that it was, as a practical, active, and direct illustration and example of what agape love looked like, what loving people looked like, not just in a mutually respective or communicative sense, but a sacrificial and even a suffering-wise sense. And with this in mind, I want to go through the characters with you and not necessarily talk about their positive traits, their quirks, their personalities, and the things that we would generally call them as likable individuals. But I want to focus on their problems. And I'm sure you're looking at your computer screen right now saying, well, it's no wonder you're not showing us your face, because I'd look you right in the eye and say, why else would I have a friend if I could only talk about them and their problems? Well, let me make this emphasis to you: one voice, two eyes, and another. What do relationships consist of if not dealing with, overcoming, and even forgiving other people's problems? Because that's the standard modem and kind of the default of what human interaction is all about, is learning to deal with one another's issues and finding a way to enjoy one another's company in spite of them. And with this all in mind, we recognize that if our relationships in life were just like kindergarten, basically, or middle school even, where we found a friend who played similar video games to us, watched similar shows, we find mutual ground, and then we focus on and possibly even build out of from there. That's definitely the way that we introduce ourselves to people, but it's not necessarily traction that's going to get you down on the road much later on. Because here's the thing, it's not the good things that define us. They're definitely perks of getting to know somebody. You have good times. But if we were to be honest about being in a fallen world, it's always going to come down to how well do you cope with the bad. And we can look point blank at even the main protagonist of this anime, Tomoya Okazaki, who was, he and of himself, not only carrying a lot of burdens, including a physical permanent injury of his shoulder because of his abusive and somewhat neglectant father, whom we will learn more about later on into the series, and not one I'm necessarily going to go into in this study today. But even more so beyond that, just the burden of bitterness and that tension between him and his family that has kind of bled into the way that he's approaching his future, is giving up on life because of the circumstances he's been set up in. But knowing that his, well, more compassionate side and personality did win the day and make him somewhat of the more popular guy around school, we do see that these are a lot of burdens to bear. And even more so beyond that, the character of whom the Dango theme is based on, Nagisa Furukawa, we see that her problems are even more burdensome. That with not only her health, but her emotional issues, and being just ridden with this guilt complex, and being so fragile-hearted that even the smallest of things can bring her to tears, happy or sad, Okazaki had a lot to deal with in his relationship with Nagisa, but that's what made it the ideal friendship, and not just a friendship, but a love relationship. Because it wasn't about what they could get from each other, it's what they could give and continue to demonstrate in spite of the obstacles. And even other characters, which go a little bit more in depth and deeper than most of the surface problems that we'd give people credit for. Fuko Ibaki, and knowing that with her eccentric personality not necessarily being an obstacle, something to get used to be sure, but her actually being a spiritual entity. And with her being a living embodiment of an injured girl in the past who's trying to manifest herself to all of these people in the school to then give her older sister the opportunity to live a happy life, and that being what matters the most to her, but then also being persuaded by this sort of isolative and almost despairing sort of attitude, and knowing that the only way she can interact with people is if they remember her or recognize her or establish some modem of her in her mind in which she can interact them through. And with all these things and her popping up at random places in the anime and being our comedy relief and starfish champion as we knew her, she had burdens just like the rest of them. Some of them a little bit more deeper than we give them credit for. But how about some of the more common? How about Kotomi Ichinose? And knowing that she was a genius girl, but noting that because of her past, because of the, well, let's be honest, psychological trauma of her not only being a genius, but being just like any other girl, and losing her parents on bad terms, has not only affected the rest of her relationships, but has completely shut her down from establishing any others than the one that she could already trust. And note, while Tomoya was that bridge in which she could build relationships with other people without hiding behind him saying, "There's they are bully," it was all about not only suffering with her problems, suffering with her obstacles, suffering with the things that made her so difficult to be around, but that through them finding a reason to love her anyway. And noting that Tomoya's relationship with Nagisa would go a different direction than it would with Tomoya or Tomoya is Okazaki, or with Kotomi or Tomoyo or Kyo or any of the other alternate world OVAs that, frankly, we all love just as much as the original storyline. It wasn't about the physical relationship. It wasn't about the future interactions or the things that they could get from or out of each other. It was just the fact and reality that they all loved each other, and in this specific form, a sacrificial form, because most of them not only ended up losing a lot, but actually ended up having to lose a lot of themselves to put up with them, to be frankly honest. With Kyo and Ryo, the two Fujibashi twins, and knowing that both of them being very emotional creatures and expressing it in different ways, with Ryo being more of an introvert and kind of a shy personality, we see more in depth into her character that her fear and her personality of being just kind of, well, not only isolative, but very difficult to express to people beyond what she already knew in her fortune tellings, which were, frankly, to be honest, very vague, if not outright wrong most of the time, if not all, and I testify to that to being biblically accurate. But even more so beyond that important point, it was that fear of hurt for her heart that her and her sister had in common, because too many people avoid pain by refusing interaction with anyone. And I think it was Charles Staples Lewis, those of you who know Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, and all those stories and such, him being a great theological thinker and, well, making a great impact in his world at the time and training great theologians such as John Lennox and many others, put it the best way I think I've ever heard it possibly said, in that the only place where you can avoid pain is to shut out love, to cut yourself off from any other human interaction, and by all means, even separating yourself from the source of life and living itself. And that place and definition is called hell. And that interaction with God is going to imply a painful journey, a painful process, and yes, even implying the risk of pain along the way. But it begs the question, was God not willing to do the same for you? Leaving that out in the open for a second, we also see that just like with her twin sister Ryo, Kyo didn't express herself necessarily through fear, but through anger, through emotional extremes, whether it was a flying crane kick or throwing a book at someone's forehead and breaking a window. She was a very radically demonstrative person. And with this personality being at the same root, we'd see that we know individuals in our lives. Anyone here can name them, of someone who is a very radically demonstrative personality, because that's as much a barrier as fear. That they, when being basically pushed into a corner, or called to commit, or called to demonstrate any form of affection, kindness, or even, love in general, of any kind or form, even amongst their family, that they automatically default to these radical emotions almost like a flare gun that's just meant to either brighten and blind or scare those who aren't familiar with it away. And this is, again, a defense mechanism against being hurt, but this was one of the many obstacles, and one of many few among a very expansive list of obstacles that we see in becoming a part of these characters' lives, of what love looks like, suffering with people. And we see that just like these individuals suffering with their past personalities and burdens is just as equal as amongst this list of very difficult obstacle to overcome. Because it's not just the people who are on your side that have to deal with them, it's also the people who are against you that could use them, and you have to suffer with them through that. With Tomoyo Sakagami and her heart being so strong, not to mention her legs and breaking a 1,000 kick combo, and Sonohara sending him through the lunch vent or the ventilation shaft and across the cafeteria, shoving his lunch meat up his nose and such. She was a very strong individual. And just like in her past, that had gone to negative sets and circumstances of making her, well, for all intents and purposes, not feared, but, well, not fearful, but feared by everyone in their neighborhood, let alone city. And as well, even beyond that, her negligence of focusing on her own strength cost her almost her own brother's life. And this trauma and burden of who she once was, having been changed through radical circumstances, is now heading in a positive direction. But just like with her desire to be student council and body president, her forced maturity you would say, was a barrier in of itself, because just as she was younger than the rest of the crowd, than Nagisa being the oldest of them respectfully, and of course being a younger classmate even to Tomoya, to Kotomi, Ryokyo, and all of these other individuals, she had not only established that place of leadership and distancing herself from people who would, well, let's be honest, not be helpful to her, like Sonohara, but even people who she'd like to have the support of, like Tomoya, like Nagisa, like the twins, like every single individual and person who would have her side. She couldn't depend on anyone but herself, still continuing that pattern. Even if it was heading in a positive direction, she wasn't fully mature yet. And how much of their lives did they have to not only expose but often bleed out onto each other in becoming a part of one another's lives and sacrificially learning more and more about each other, if not through osmosis, that eventually led them to realize, man, if I had a choice and if I knew from first face before actually investing in you that it would cost this much, I would have gone out first face, right? Well, we see other side examples like Yohei Sonohara and his pride and anger essentially preventing him from establishing relationships with people other than those he knows he already trusts, with Nagisa's parents, Akio and Sanai, and having to give up their dreams for their daughter's sake and learning what was more valuable, their daughter's life or their own, and knowing that that role of parenting is actually what God intended to be, that form of love. With Misai and Shima, knowing that whole story, with the cat actually being the remanifestation of a spiritual entity and all those other things. That's not only remembering what someone has done and the impact made on their lives, but why you chose to love someone in the first place, and remembering the legacy that they left. Yukimiya and her brother, all the different things that we learned from Clannad and establishing these relationships with people. I want to just tile these individuals in and say, what a large pile of problems we have here. What a great and honest look at the individuals that we would all compare to people we have in our own lives that would be considered nothing more than the natural obstacles in our hearts between us and loving each other the way that God intended us to, because in a fallen world we not only have fallen circumstances, but we ourselves are fallen people. And just like these lives that are filled with pain and filled with obstacles and seeming like every single step forward always results in sliding 2 steps back, or if I don't raise my knee up to a certain length, I'm just going to end up to continue to sink and have to work harder next in this endless climb to nowhere. You would think that it's almost a pointless journey. Why would I establish relationships at all if I knew they would hurt so much? And that's the most important detail, is not only the reason for starting them and continuing them, but what the future of them ultimately is going to amount to. Because what love was so great that it even lasted and endured through death, that it still found a reason to keep going through despair and pain and loss? We need to understand, with all of these things being demonstrated, there was no clearer illustration not only of biblical love in the heart of Jesus than Ushio herself. And I almost have to pause by saying her name, because we understand how great and grieving a loss that was. So not only have Tomoya see the fruition of such a beautiful relationship with Nagisa, not only set and founded in purity, but almost by surprise when anything good came out of it, because it wasn't for his sake, it was for hers. But even more so beyond that, for this sweet and lovable girl to come into the world and never be able to meet and see her mommy. But even more so than that, her father missing the first 5 years of her life, and the last 5 years even more tragically. All of these things that were meant to be an illustration of the parallel story that had been going on in the anime since episode 1. Because we know the girl in the illusionary world was Ushio. And with this in mind, with this illustration, this spiritual parallel to a physical reality, Ushio was alone and isolated and can only interact with the one she loved most, her papa, through an automaton, basically, that couldn't speak but could only move, gesture, and understand her words. Now, Who do you think that is illustrating? Who do you think that is meant to represent? What can we learn from in our relationship with God and the reality of Scripture as God has spoken it to us, if I haven't answered your question already, if not through this very same illustration? To bring this to light, I want you to understand that with all of their lives, all of their pain, it all ended pointlessly. And that's what made the anime so tragic, at least up until episode 19. Because with all of these things in mind, it only took a miracle to reset the clock and give them a future worth living in. But it was at the cost of Ushio giving up that world behind the scenes. Now, here's the thing. Just like in the anime of Clannad, that there's a world behind this one where things are not only paralleled and reflective, but almost amplified by the things that we do in this life. That just like all of their lives ended with tragedy, there was no point for this love and relationship if there wasn't a future worth living in them. But even more so, if there wasn't someone on the other side willing to become a part of and invest in it. Because if Ushio wasn't a part of their future, what was the point of living in it, right? Now here's the thing. What is the question? Why is it that no matter how long life lasts, we're always repulsed by it ending? This reality of death has become such a commonplace disgust. I mean, nothing can be further from the truth. It fascinates us, but it also repulses us. Because if you would just mark on a tally board how many times you've seen death on TV and in video games and in any other mode of entertainment. Levi Lesko points this out well in his Bible study, Bread and Circuses, discussing how to live on a higher form of life, which I encourage you to listen to on your own time. But based off of the anime Clannad, why was it that death had to be such an active and existent reality in the lives of these individuals? Why was it that through the ultimate demonstration of love that history has ever seen, that literally redefined the definition of love, came from Clannad just as much as it came through the life and death of Jesus Christ? John chapter 3, verses 13 through 17 says this: "No one has ascended into heaven but he who came down from heaven, that is, the Son of Man who is in heaven. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever so believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved." Now, since episode 1 of Clannad, we always looked at that illusionary tale as just a story somehow that Nagisa was speaking from her imagination. But as we finally get to the last episode and see that world's final destruction, when winter finally comes on that place, and, well, for all intents and purposes, her father's hope is finally returned to her by the birth cries once again of the daughter he thought he'd lost. Who else had to give up their child so that we could have a future worth living in? Who lost everything so that we could actually have the chance of receiving something once again? Now, knowing that it was because of love that God sent his Son into the world, just like because Ushio loved her father, that she was willing to give up her world to give her father his back. What kind of love saved us? What kind of love is commanded of us? What kind of love is impossible to demonstrate without him that is present throughout this anime as a whole? Well, 1 Corinthians 13 verses 4 through 8. Paul the Apostle defines this new agape love in literally a word-by-word description of the heart and character of Jesus Christ. Love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy, love does not parade itself, is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. Now, taking this anime from first face, not only in the messianic implications, but also the personal and practical of the life and death of Jesus Christ, and seeing how he interacted with others and with us, and why, just like with Tomoya, people were just naturally attracted to him as an individual because of his character. Were there individuals who had to suffer with each other, and sometimes suffer along with one another, maybe for 3 or 4 episodes, and maintain a level of kindness even when it wasn't easy? Was there a love in this anime that was sensitive to another's needs, even if it seemingly didn't make sense to them at the time, that they still considered that there would need to be time before this relationship could be established, not only with Nagisa and Tomoya, reestablishing Tomoya's relationship with their father, but even with Kotomi and the barriers that she had put up based off of the burdens of her past? Was their love pure? Was there any inclination of physical relationship in this beyond the fan fictions that people wrote, totally missing the point of this anime? Was there a love that only focused on the good of people, and not only that, but was willing to forgive and even ignore the faults of other individuals? Was there a love in this anime that bared all things, even their parents? Hoped all things, even when it seemed like there was no hope? Endures all things, even death? We see Christ's heart, and the whole anime's point. Love is suffering, and no one has ever suffered more for you. No one has ever demonstrated this kind of love towards you than the one who suffered more than any other individual in human history. They say to die of crucifixion is to die 1,000 deaths. That it was not only the most cruel, barbaric, and drawn-out process of not only fighting for every breath, but also because of the wounds, the flogging, the loss of energy due to blood loss, the strangulation that would result as having your rotary arteries just basically strained to tearing on the nails, and on top of that, your radial and arterial muscles, or your lateral muscles, basically pushing against your lungs, against the rib cage and your spine, so that the only way to breathe would be to run your back up and down the splintered wood of the cross. Not only having been exposed from that, but the brutal beatings that he received from the hands of Jews and Romans alike, and note, both the individuals he was doing this for in the first place. Even more so beyond any of this, with Ushio being a fine example of not only Jesus' heart, who left heavenly glory and became a part of ours once again, to not only take away from our suffering, and the greatest possible suffering, and that being separation from him forever in hell, but even more so beyond that, that in the midst of our suffering, to suffer with us, to love us through this life, not just after it. And even more so beyond any of this, that it was when we were at our worst that God chose to love us. It was when mankind had developed the most brutal form of killing someone. Then God chose to step in, and since the foundation of the world, the Holy Spirit, God the Father, and the Son all actively chose and decided, I am going to create you, knowing I'll have to save you. Romans chapter 5, verses 6 through 8, for when you were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love towards us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. You need to understand that just like in this anime, that you have a bunch of very messed up individuals that for some reason we found the capacity to love anyway. But it was at the point when you were literally demonstrated as the most unlovable individual in history that the source of love itself said, I will give up everything to save that individual. And to this day he looks you in the eye and says, by the scars on my hands, you were worth it. Thank you for your time and listening to this study. I hope it's been a blessing to you and provided some extended light on appreciating and enjoying this anime as a whole. If there are other themes in the anime you'd like to discuss or questions about the themes that have been discussed, leave them in the comments below. I'd be more than happy to talk about them. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, leave a like and subscribe for more in the future. It's a great encouragement, but most importantly, if you know someone who knows the anime but not the message, who knows the stories and the characters but not the one it was meant to illustrate, please share this study with anyone you feel needs to hear it and to know not only of individuals that love each other, but that there's a God out there who still loves them. Thank you for your time and listening to the study, and remember, Jesus loves you.